to make if you want to change this, you have to make safe and acceptable pathways. So that's the first part, is finding safe and acceptable pathways. Information is also important. Parents and females may not know actually that tailoring or dressmaking is kind of a dying sector and nobody's really making much money in it these days. They're either importing used clothing or new clothing from China, and that it's kind of even people are shipping their uniforms off to China or Bangladesh or wherever to be made from Africa. That it's really not a good sector in which their daughters can really make a lot of money. So that's another point about information. And information, I think, combined with a pathway for females that will work, I think can make a difference. Cash is needed to start a business. That's a problem for everyone, for all youth. And here, and where do women get it? Now, one of the things we've discovered is that when they leave school, females are much more likely to spend time either working in their family business, working in agriculture, saying they're not in the labor force, doing domestic chores or whatever. And that although I said that men and women, the household enterprise sector is pretty gender equal, females enter it later. And I think and one reason, we don't know for sure, but one reason may be this difficulty of getting cash. In my interviews, in my qualitative work, a lot of females said, well, I got my cash from my husband. I wanted to start a business and he agreed I should start a business. I got my cash from my husband. Well, that means you have to wait, get married, get some savings and, get your cash. It may be that if you're the son, it's easier to get the cash from the relatives. Now, what is breaking down that barrier a bit? These savings groups that are starting, which are going sort of beyond the Roscas to be more savings groups and kind of like credit cooperatives, savings and credit cooperatives. A lot of these are being formed with women in the village, in the area, and that's helping, especially young women. And they also have, when those kind of groups are formed, then they also have mentors. And I think a number of NGOs, but I think about Oxfam and CRS as being ones that are and CARE that are very active in trying to get these groups going. Cities Alliance is also doing it in urban areas. And so I think that's an important point. If there's no structured pathway to work, parents may worry. They don't worry about their son kind of kicking around and trying to find his way in the world, but they certainly do worry about their daughter, and so they may push females into early marriage before they get a chance as well. So that's another issue. And finally, once they start a business, women are much more likely than men to say that they had to stop their business. If you ask them why they closed their business, or if they cut back their business. Why? Because of an illness or something in the family. So a household risk may be, it's clearly our studies from the Rural Investment Climate Survey suggest that that's affecting women more than men. So I think that's what I would call the main issues.
Great, thanks Louise. Sylvia. Your book, which I see you've got there, the Winning the War for Talent in Emerging Markets, also highlighted how women tend to concentrate in certain sectors as well, in emerging, the BRIC economies. So it would be interesting to hear from you about how this plays out in practice and how gender norms in particular work in this context.
Thank you, Jeni. Let me also try and make some links between, the various levels of the economy. First off, some drumbeats through all of our work, I think. Sexual harassment, huge. We find that it's one of the top 4 reasons for why a professional woman might get discouraged. And certain jobs are off limits. For instance, being a traveling salesperson in the pharmaceutical sector, totally not open to women because of what would happen to you. So what is really happening on the ground is that employers are stepping up to the plate. There is a scarcity of truly skilled people. Only 15% of college grads in India, China, are thought to be ready for employment in global corporations, meaning that the very high levels of unemployment amongst college grads disguises a quality issue. I mean, it's a complex issue. But amongst that top 15%, there are equal numbers of men and women, so they have to become appealing to the women at the top of the heap. So what are they doing? Well, all over the emerging markets, employers, whether they're headquartered in Paris or in Mumbai, are providing help with commuting to work. There are armed guards as well as vans all over India. In Brazil, they protect female employees at ATMs because in Brazil it's not sexual harassment, it's actually being attacked violently, either in a carjacking or at an ATM. So, you know, companies like Bloomberg and companies like Genpact and Lenovo are stepping up to the plate because this labor is very precious to them. So this is the paradox. There's a flight from domestic private sector companies to global companies by the well-qualified women in these markets. It's not occupational segregation, it's more multinational versus local private sector players. And global corporations are doing stuff for their women in these markets they're not doing here. E&Y, Carrefour, Siemens, Amex, Cisco, it's a very long list. They do much more imaginative things in terms of flex time and help with commuting and help with childcare on site than happens in Peoria or Oakland. And there should be a feedback loop. I mean, we need to get a little more demanding here because it's not just the super professional worker, but it's the call center woman, right? Who also are hanging out in Texas and Florida and all kinds of places in the US. So there's a very interesting set of lessons, I think, for what to do with that kind of lower level professional female worker who right now is getting a rather interesting deal in these other emerging markets. I'll give you an example. E&Y does something incredible in India. They stage a series of family days for the older generation in the families of their female workers, because they understand that the person they need to buy into the daughter's career is often the father-in-law and the mother-in-law or the mother or the father, not the husband. The husband, according to our data, is generally supported because guess what? If you're living in Mumbai or Sao Paulo, you need those two incomes, and everyone understands that because these are, some of the most expensive cities in the world to live on the fringes of. But it's the older generation that will be the roadblock. So they put on a whole day, which is not a barbecue or a picnic. It is actually a very serious discussion of what they're offering their daughters or their daughters-in-law in terms of earning power and pathways to a better life. And the room is full of hundreds of 55-year-olds who buy in to the careers of these young women. I mean, if we could do that here, it would be pretty terrific, particularly in Hispanic America. So, what we are finding, and we have about 100 best practices that we've been following in these countries, is that there is a small revolution going on. And it is not so limited because we are talking about the back office functions of global corporations and not just, investment bankers or private law firms. So there is this thread of good news. And then the other thing I want to say, which echoes what people are touching on around this panel, is that women, when they become significant earners, do assume a kind of responsibility for family that is not seen in their male peers. For instance, females working in largish companies in India, whether they be local companies or multinationals, spend 20% of their income on their elders. For men, the figure is 9%. They're picking up a disproportionate load back home, not just for their kids, but also for their elders. And therefore, somehow this group of, newly in the marketplace women are contributing massively to the social well-being of these nations that still have very thin safety nets for the older generation.
Thanks, Sylvia. It reminds me this morning there was actually a story over the wires about, not that it's breaking today, about the share of elderly in China. I think now it's 1 in 4. And that it was particularly in rural areas because right. So many young people now have moved to the cities. But I just want to have just one brief follow-up question on whether the innovations and good practices that you see with the global corporations, whether that's flowing through to domestic employers.
I have some examples. Obviously, there's a recalcitrance. Women, in a way of voting with their feet, they still prefer to work for global companies than locally based companies because they see them as more women empowering. We have a lot of numbers on that. But for instance, it's contagious because you are competing in the same marketplace for a limited pool. So Genpact, which is India-based, it's got 44,000 people. It's mostly back office business services. They, for instance, have just put their senior managers on the hook in the following way. You need to, as a senior manager at Genpact right now, produce 0 attrition amongst your high-performing female team. Otherwise, your bonuses get docked. Now, is this changing the numbers at the top for women? Sure it is. It's a very radical move. And the reason that they've done that is that they're fed up of old-style, patriarchal Indian males refusing to promote their women. And this is headed up by an Indian man.
Great. There's actually an initiative, an IFC initiative called Winvest, which is doing quite a nice job documenting good practices on kind of attraction, kind of recruitment and retention of female employees. I can send you the link to that. They've pulled it together, which may be of interest. But Namita, you outlined, I think, quite well the various constraints which come across, which are indeed pervasive but worse for female firms. Could you just pick one of those and talk about how kind of private sector innovation is trying to get around those?
So let's look at one of the key productive inputs for entrepreneurship, access to finance. And let's see what's going on there. So women around the world usually start with lower levels of financial capital than men. Mostly women who start up a business, they have to rely on either their own savings or they borrow from their husband or their families or their friends, but they don't usually access formal credit. 30% of enterprises in the world are female-owned, but only less than 10% of the credit, less than 10% of them have access to credit. Even in Kenya, where 50% of the micro and SME enterprises are owned and managed by women, the percentage of credit that they have, or access to formal credit that they have, is less than 10%. Even in Italy, women tend to pay more for overdraft facilities than men. So what's really going on? So let's look at the supply side of it. Why are banks not lending to women? So when we work with the private sector, we find that there are a couple of recurring themes, whichever part of the world you work in the developing world. Number one, banks say that we think women are risky business. Why? Because women do not usually have collateral or property rights or a formal land title that they can bring to the bank and say, can I raise a loan? So bankers feel that this is risky. How can I give a loan without a collateral guarantee? So this is risky. This is one. Number two, a lot of banks say that, frankly, we don't know how to cater to this market. We don't know what the special needs are and how we might cater to them. And third, interestingly, even where among our clients, where banks are lending to women, a number of them say, we don't really honestly know how this portfolio is doing. Why? Because they haven't really thought about looking at female-owned enterprises as a market segment in itself. And so they haven't been tracking their portfolio. So it's a bit of a blind spot for them. On the supply side, on the demand side, a number of women say, we don't really apply for a bank loan in the first place. Why? Because, well, we don't have a formal land title. I don't have property. So how am I going to go to a bank and raise a loan? So there is a curbed demand there from the side, on the part of women. The second recurring theme on the demand side is that women say, processes are too cumbersome. Frankly, I don't have the skills or the financial literacy to even fill out a loan application. So there's a clear capacity building need here. So what we did very recently, AFRCE, we piloted 4 interventions in Africa, in Malawi, in Tanzania, in Nigeria, and Uganda. So when we began working with this bank in Nigeria, we said, and we started having this conversation, the bank said, but yeah, we can see that there are a large number of women entrepreneurs. We can also see that that nobody's really extending credit to them. So clearly this is an untapped market, and it would make sense to get into this market, but we don't know how to do it. So we started working with this bank, trying to develop a product that would be specially useful to the women's segment of the market. One of the elements that we introduced was this whole issue of collateral. So yes, overnight we cannot change the fact that women do not have property or a formal land title that they can use as collateral. But one asset that a number of women do have is jewelry. I mean, this is true for a large number of women, even in South Asia. Women do have jewelry. So we worked with the bank to see if they could extend a flexible collateral option, and it worked. And there were a number of other things that we did. It wasn't just the collateral bit, but we did a number of other things to offer, especially to this particular, to the women's market. And in other countries, for example, in Tanzania also, we worked on, again, a flexible collateral option where we gave loans to, we helped the bank give loans to women to buy equipment and use that equipment as collateral. In certain other parts where we found women said, well, I cannot go to the bank during the week. And the bank said, all right, we can extend our banking hours to the weekend so women can come after church. Now, what happened? This is a very recent initiative, but what happened was this bank in Nigeria very quickly realized that this was really good business. So within a year, they lent about $15 million to women entrepreneurs, to 100 women entrepreneurs, and they saw that this was excellent. Their NPLs were doing great. This segment of their business was doing great. And so it was a myth buster for them to realize that women are not actually risky business. So other banks in Nigeria who were watching this bank also said, yes, let's not miss our share of the pie. So they started doing pretty much the same thing. And this bank in Nigeria had operations in other parts of Africa, so they very quickly extended to other parts of Africa. So what we saw, it was very nice to see that actually slowly the market was beginning to transform itself. In Nigeria, for example, now the Banking Association put out special awards for catering to women. So there was a change there. What did it do to us, AFRCE? So obviously we saw this was great business, so it would be foolish of us not to learn from our own experience. So we took our lessons from Africa and then took it to of course, we customize wherever we go, depending on the market. But we took our experience to MENA, to other parts of Asia, and it really worked. And then we, for example, now have mainstreamed gender in our financial markets business. So because the investment officer or the TLs now think that this is not just something that's nice to do, but it's also very good business. So when an IO talks to a potential client on SME business, gender comes up sort of automatically. So there's a mainstreaming even within IFC, and we've built a target for ourselves now to increase the amount of business we do with women. So even for us within IFC, things have started changing. On the demand side, it was clear to us that just working with banks was not enough. We also had to address the demand side of the situation. So the advisory side of IFC then started working with women entrepreneurs on building capacity, building their financial literacy. But the interesting element we built there was that we used the bank as an intermediary for our training programs. Why did we do that? Now, the reason for that is that if you have a bank that is further lending to women entrepreneurs as an intermediary in that training program, you have an inbuilt mechanism to ensure that the training program is going to be effective, because the bank has a vested interest in ensuring that the training program is going to be effective in helping the woman entrepreneur expand her business. So what we learned from this whole experience is that if you're able to address the demand and the supply side, and if you build in a private sector sort of almost vested interest in making sure that it works, you can really scale it up and transform the market. I mean, I'm not saying the entire market is transformed, but there's a very good beginning.
Louise, you've looked at lots of policy interventions in a whole range of programs in Africa, I guess some less successful than others, including, if you like, coverage and ensuring access and so on. What do you learn from kind of the success and failure of policy and program interventions? Not everything, I guess. Just give us a couple of 2-3 highlights.
Well, I think in terms of breaking through on the gender gap, I think that NGOs are actually having perhaps more success than governments. I mentioned that traditional training programs tended to kind of perpetuate some of these fairly conservative norms and stereotypes. And so for that reason, I think it's no surprise that it's actually been NGOs that have been able to find a way through this thicket and find the ways that can make, the young females entering the market and their families comfortable with looking at a new route and a new approach, or are able to find a safe way to make a safe space to organize, like, for example, what Brock is doing in East Africa, to find a way to create a safe space for females in the village to kind of have a chance to look at different aspirations and whatever. And I think that's a critical lesson. It's not clear that what governments need to do is jump in. What they need to do is make space for these kinds of activities, perhaps provide some demand-driven financing for them. I think a second point, where governments can be successful, I think, is ensuring better access to education and training programs and demand-side financing. And the problem is everybody's trying so hard to get access. I think, for example, targeted scholarships for females it's much more acceptable than South Asia than in sub-Saharan Africa today. 10 years ago, we had a World Bank loan in Tanzania that provided scholarships just targeted to get females into secondary school, and the parents of boys objected. And it got changed to be just for poor people, boys and girls, even if there is a difference, in terms of willingness to pay for the rest. So I do think in trying to ensure that access, that's a help. I think basically, fundamentally, what governments need to focus on is getting more foreign direct investment in the first place. That is creating, because that's what's going to create large firms create a lot of jobs fast. And a lot of the money and the know-how to do that often lies outside of the country, or at least if you're going to export, you need that kind of partnership. And so I think that's another area where governments need to be successful. And I think when you make more opportunities available in general in the economy, then we've seen that women are able to grab them. I think, in terms of things like migration and these kind of flows, that's really not an area where governments can be effective. I think they need to get a broad-based economic growth outside of the mineral sector. And I think that's what really is going to make much more of a broad-based difference for women.
Great, Louise. I just wanted to put one final question to Sylvia, then we'll open up. You've all been very patient. And I was just going to ask you, Sylvia, about, again, kind of following this theme on the policy side, about kind of the role of quotas and the potential for quotas. There was a recent FT story that you might have seen that showed that I guess it was the entry rate into among board appointments had kind of dropped sharply recently for the top 100 FTSE companies. So it had been running, I think, around 50% because they were trying to increase the average. It dropped to something like 12% apparently. So just wanted to put kind of the issue of quotas on the table, because I think it's interesting in the context of corporate boards, but I think also has more general kind of interest as well.
Quotas is a fascinating topic because if you only look at the board level, you actually don't do anything about the supply of leaders, right? So the new efforts, even in Europe, are about enriching the pool of private sector leaders that could eventually be fed through to boards, because otherwise you get something which is called the golden skirts, which is, the very few women in senior management serving on 14 boards because there's so few of them, and it's self-limited, as we're seeing. So I think efforts to get more women in real leadership positions is a much more fruitful way to go. And interestingly, both the EU and NAFTA have pioneered over the last 6 months new equality standards in terms of executive positions within companies. And just this month, E&Y has gotten 50 companies in the UK to sign on to an equality standard, which is hopefully going to be, some kind of golden mean in multinational corporations, which sets a target number of non-pale males in decision-making roles in companies that are going to do serious business in Europe and in Latin America. So I think this is the wave of the future. I think the board thing tends to be a little bit of a red herring because it does nothing about the supply of fabulous, lead women and multicultural people at the executive level.
Great. Non-pale male. I have to remember that one. Yeah. Although with the Australian accent, I guess I'll have to repeat it several times before people know
Indeed,
that.
yes.
Well, let me open it up now. We have about 20 minutes for a conversation now. I think that you should take advantage of this very experienced panel that we have here. Just raise your hand or raise your mic or whatever works.
Hi. Sure. I'm Summer. I work on the IFC side in the Women in Business unit. And I have a question for Sylvia. You gave a lot of very, very inspiring examples of multinationals that are doing great work and self-regulating and setting their own standards in terms of empowering women in their workforce. And my question to you is, we're looking into labor regulation and how labor regulation may incentivize or prevent women from entering the workforce, and how it creates safe working conditions or unsafe working conditions. And my question to you is, do you see that because of such a strong business case, multinationals are actually doing that work already by self-regulating, and governments have missed the boat, and we don't really need to bother ourselves with labor laws because the corporations are taking care of themselves, or do we need to look at that dimension as well, which is the regulatory and legal dimension of it?
It's a great question, and I think enlightened self-interest only goes so far. I mean, look at what just happened in Bangladesh. You know, H&M finally came through on the right side of the equation because of tremendous public pressure, right? So, you know, I don't have, you know, rose-tinted glasses. But let's take the example of Russia. It's fascinating. Safety is a massive issue in Russia. It's somehow culturally acceptable to put all kinds of workers at risk. But the worst culprits are actually the private Russian-owned companies. And there's a huge flight of talent to global companies from Russian-owned companies because there is some sense of evolving decent. If you're an Alcoa or a BP, you know, you have been forced by pressure to create somewhat decent standards. And it's not just women, it's, you know, everyone. So I think the devil is in the detail. You know, one has to look at what's happening on the ground. But